Now we're going to talk about interaction. What I thought that you might enjoy is if I show you this cool modern art mobile that I got to give a little visual anchor, visual demonstration of interaction. Now I could take this thing if I wanted to get it moving, and I could start turning all of these components. As you can see, they're connected by a string in the middle. And I could shake it violently. I could put it out in the wind. But if I wanted to do something more interesting, and I wanted to exert kind of the least amount of effort and create the most interesting systemic result, I could maybe just take one of these, right, and start it spinning. And just notice what happens, even though I only spun one of them, how now the two on either side of it, took them a while to actually start moving. You may have noticed that. Then they started moving, and then they began transferring the energy to those above and below. And soon, they all seem to be moving in different directions. And as they move and twist the thread that connects them, they're transmitting the energy and the direction back up and down the stack to each other. And this is a much more interesting interaction, I think. Now, if I were to say right now, how did I get it moving like this? You probably never would have guessed that I moved one of them, and now they're all moving in slightly different directions in this combination. So the interesting thing about systems and the interaction of the forces in the system is that it's almost impossible to tell what happened. It's almost impossible to look at the system and figure out which part was moved. And a lot of times when a system gets out of whack, it's very difficult to trace it back and say, okay, you took the third one from the top and spun it clockwise. Right? I don't think that, 10 seconds after I spun that, there probably isn't a person alive, okay, that could look at a videotape of it and figure it out on their own, within an hour or something. And yet it's so simple. So systems are funny like that. The interaction of the parts, right, they're very sensitive. They affect each other. And by just changing one part, it can affect the whole system so much. And of course, as systems do, they usually return to equilibrium, as we're seeing this system begin to return to equilibrium. Let's get a little visual analogy for the interaction of parts. And with that, Dr. Woodsmall.
Okay, we're talking about interaction. Carlos is learning from Don Juan. And Don Juan says, the first act of a teacher is to introduce the idea that the world we think we see is only a view, only a description of the world. Every effort of the teacher is geared to prove this point to his apprentice, but accepting it seems to be one of the hardest things that one can ever do. We are complacently caught in our particular view of the world, which compels us to feel and act as if we know everything about the world. A teacher, from the first act he performs, aims at stopping that view. In other words, those of you who think that you know everything about the world are most upsetting to those of us that do. Okay, so we're talking about interaction. And we have the mobile to see how the parts of a mobile that are interconnected. And it's one of a system. It's a complex system, but it's a fixed system. But when we started looking at interaction in more complex systems, then we began to start making some interesting discoveries. Now, the question is, where do we look? Where do we look at the world? Where do we look at the world? We usually look at the holons, we look at the wholes, or we look at the parts. We either try to synthesize up and figure out what is the bigger holon of which that's a part, or we take it apart and try to figure out what the parts are that make it up. Now, those are two views, and we can learn things from both of them. And certainly we live in a world in which people are trained in analysis and are good at it, and what they really need is to be trained in synthesis. But they need another view. Another view is, what is the relationship between the parts? What is the relationship between the parts? And the relationship between the parts is the interaction. So we've all heard the thing like the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, but we're not told what the whole is. So it's the product of the interactions of the parts. The product of the interactions of the parts. So if we really want to understand the system, then we need to look and see how the parts are in interaction. If we want to improve the system, the normal analytic approach is, well, let's replace the parts. We've said that doesn't work. If we want to improve the system, we've got to work on improving the interactions between the components of the system. So if we want to build a greater car, we've got to figure out ways in which we can decrease the friction, which is the negative side of the interaction, or in which we can increase the throughput so more power is going to go through. And as we begin to do that, then we can increase. But simply looking at the parts isn't going to do it. It's looking at the interaction. Now, when we look at human systems too, what we tend to do is we may look at a group or a team, and then we may analyze in terms of it's made up of these components and these players and these people and these parts. But where the real leverage is as we begin to look at the interactions between the parts. And of course, Group Dynamics 101 is basically a way of starting to look at the interactions between the parts. And when we look at the interactions of the part of a chimp community or a chimp commune, sometimes in the business world called a team, and when we look at these highly dubious things called teams, then we find certain kinds of behavior that are involved, not surprisingly. So we find certain people that say, hey, go team, and we want everything to be subsumed into the team. And we want everybody then to cooperate, collaborate, work together, all rewards will be equally shared, and we're all team players. On the other end, we've got some people that are not so sure about this, and that they would rather than that everybody, if they're going to have to be part of the team, that everybody has individual responsibility, that they can begin to do their thing. And then there are some people that are what we call proximity players, so that they want to be part of the team, but they want to have a assigned role within the team. So immediately we get these interactive dynamics. And when we look at the team players, we find that there's three kinds of activities they're engaged in. Some of it is self-directed behavior. In other words, these are the people that are focused on the agency end of the continuum. They're focused on their rights. They're focused on getting their way and getting everybody on the team to do what they want to do. So that's one kind of behavior. We call this control behavior. There are other people that are focused in a different place, and they're focused on getting the members of the team then to work and cooperate together and to collaborate, and they're focused on harmony. They're focused then on people working together. They're focused on maintenance behavior. So they're continually trying to protect everybody on the team, to eliminate conflict, hostility, and focus on cooperation, collaboration. And then there's still another third force that we find, and it's about getting things done. It's called achievement. and everything is focused on whatever the mission, the goal. Everything has to take second fiddle to achieving the mission and the goal. And of course, these three things are involved in a perpetual and continual struggle with each other. So the primary point here is, if we really want to understand the world, we need to look at the interactions between the players. Luhmann, who's perhaps the greatest sociologist, and his approach to sociology is quite different, since sociology studies human society, and one of the things where it's focused is usually it focuses on the players, on the combination of all of these things, and he says the communicative act is where the focus needs to be. The connection is where the focus needs to be. What are you doing in your life? Where are you focusing? Are you focusing on yourself? Are you focusing on the group? Or are you focusing on the interactions? The greatest leverage is in the interactions. The greatest leverage is in the interactions. So, another way of looking at the world, another way of using your brain to create success. Don't get caught up by the wholes, don't get caught up by the parts, but look at the interactions of the parts, because that's where efficiency, effectiveness live, is in the interactions. And if you want to increase those, you got to work with the interactions, and you got to work with trying to move them toward greater and greater variety. And the more variety, the more flexibility, then the more power and the more effective the system will be. Something to think about. And now there's this thing that some of you are all too familiar with, because you in your life have had the opportunity to receive a great deal of it. It's called feedback. Now then, as a child, undoubtedly adults feel that their primary function in life is to give you feedback. Teachers feel their primary function in life is to give you feedback. And spouses usually feel their primary function in life is to give you feedback. And so have you ever walked up to somebody and said, "Would you like some feedback?" And so what does the person say? "Not really, and not from you." So, once again, so let's talk a little bit about feedback. So we're going to talk about feedback in two contexts. First is in the context of a system, in context of cybernetics. So what do we mean by feedback? So, feedback is the return of information to form a closed control loop. The return of information to form a closed control loop. Now we're suddenly talking a different language. We suddenly got a new view of the world. We're using a word, information. We're starting to look at the world in terms not just of parts, not just of wholes, not just of interaction, but in terms of information. And what is information? Gregory Bateson said, information is news of difference. If we already know it, it doesn't inform us. If we already know it, it doesn't inform us. It only informs us if it's something we didn't know, if it's news of difference. Okay, so feedback. Now then, feedback is the return of part of a system's output to its input, which is thereby changed. Okay, the return of part of a system's output to its input, which is thereby changed. And we've talked about this thermostat somewhere in the room, and we set it at a certain temperature, and our bodies heat the room, and at a certain point, the temperature crosses a threshold. The feedback mechanism then causes the thermostat to turn on the air conditioner. The air conditioner starts cooling the room, and once it cools it to a certain temperature, then it turns it off, and it keeps doing this. So what is the feedback? The feedback is the temperature of the room is fed back into the system, causing it to modify its behavior. Now then, there can be two kinds of feedback. Positive feedback takes an increase in output back to increase the input. So in other words, things start going faster and faster. Things start increasing at an exponential rate. So positive feedback in general is dangerous because things only operate within a certain limit. And if we exceed that limit, usually we exceed the capacity of the system to handle it. So we got to be real careful with positive feedback. I talked about rabbits. Rabbits produce at a phenomenal rate. And if we didn't do something to control that, pretty soon the universe would be full of rabbits. And human beings would have to do a lot of eating in order to keep this situation in check. So, now then, this other type of feedback is negative feedback. Takes back an output increase to decrease the input. This is stabilizing in principle. So, once again, we've got to be careful of amplification and of things in feedback that amplifies or increases, because out of control amplification soon becomes destable. So we need to have ways of decreasing whatever the system is, and when we can do that, we can control it and we can stabilize it. So we got positive and negative feedback. Now, notice that we're using feedback in a different sense here. So frequently it's used in common language as simply a response to a stimulus, where here we're using it in a technical sense in the cybernetic meaning of the term. Now then, once again, this is where it gets interesting. Feedback is a method of controlling a system by reinserting into it the result of its past performance. If these results are merely used as numerical data for the criticism of the system and its regulation, we have the simple feedback of the control engineers. If, however, the information which proceeds backward from the performance is able to change the general method and pattern of performance, we have a process called learning. Let me go that again. If, however, the information which proceeds backwards from the performance is able to change the general method and pattern of performance, we have a process called learning. Eben and I operate out of an understanding of learning that is based on this, which means if there's no behavioral change, there's no learning. When we ask you, what have you learned? And you said you learned that, then immediately time out. How will your life be different as a result of the process? How will your life be different as a result of the process? So, feedback, not Wheaties, is the breakfast of champions. So one of the most important things we can then learn is how to use a feedback appropriately and how to respond to feedback appropriately. Feedback is the primary thing that is going to allow us to grow. The cybernetic thesis, self-regulatory mechanisms also apply to the mind and underlie human behavior. Pattern thus organizes both physical and mental activity. All purposeful behavior may be considered to require feedback. That's a biggie. All purposeful, i.e. intentional behavior, can be seen to require feedback. So earlier we talked about the tote model. So the general model is we've got a goal out there. We engage in some kind of behavior. We see if it's helping move us toward the goal. If it is, we keep doing it. If it doesn't work, anything has a higher probability of working than what doesn't work. So we need to stop doing it. It's not about trying harder. It's about requisite variety, trying something else. And what allows us to know it's not working is feedback. What allows us to know it's not working is feedback. So one of the most critical things then that's going to be part of our journey to using our mind and to use our brain to create success is really understanding and utilizing this process of feedback. Now then, there's several things about feedback. Some feedback is immediate, but it's rare. A lot of feedback takes a while or it's delayed. So therefore, we need to be always looking for feedback. We need to be always looking for feedback that tells us something important, that what we're doing is working or not. We need to look for feedback that tells us if what we're doing is working or not. And therefore, we need what we call short feedback loops. We don't have the luxury of waiting years to find out whether it's going to work or not. We need to try to find out as quickly as possible if it's working or not. And now then, in human interactions then, people give you all the feedback you'll ever need in order to deal with them. It's just you've got to be able to calibrate and tell what their response is. So therefore, calibration and sensory acuity become absolutely critical in human interactions. We can't go running around asking everybody, do you like it? Am I doing okay? Are we on track? You've got to be able to observe, see what kind of responses you're getting. And since a human being itself is a cybernetic system, and a human being then is going to respond in some way, and it's a case of reading these cues, reading the response. Now then, so if we want to move rapidly on the path, we need to be able to calibrate the feedback we're continually getting from other people. If we want to move more rapidly, we might set up relationships with other people where it's appropriate for them to give us feedback and it's appropriate for us to receive feedback. So this simply ups the ante, and it also requires a certain amount of trust. Now then, so we need to understand the most important person hearing feedback that we give somebody else is frequently ourselves. We need to understand that feedback seldom produces change because people have a vested interest in who they are. So it's not just any feedback, it's the kind of feedback that's going to lead to learning and going to lead to behavioral change. Now that's the kind of feedback you need to be giving yourself, and that's the kind of feedback you need to be giving others in a relationship with them. In a training context like this, we've set up frames. Frames where when you come in here, it's expected that you're going to be open to feedback, and it's expected that you're going to give and receive respectful feedback, and feedback that's focused on helping you grow, evolve, change, so your behavior when you leave here will be different. And every step of this seminar, we're using a feedback mechanism. It's called an exercise. And we have people come up and report. And we're continually observing to see, is change, is behavioral change occurring? Is the aha experience occurring? Are people beginning to become aware and beginning to understand? So what does it boil down to? It all boils down to then these three things. It boils down to interaction. Interaction. It involves the interaction of the parts, focusing on the interaction of the parts. Also, we are a cybernetic organism. We are made up of parts. And one of the most important things that you can do is establish communication channels between your parts. One of the goals in life, if you're going to remain focused, is alignment. You got to get the parts aligned. To get them aligned, you got to get them to be, one, aware of each other, two, to communicate with each other. So we need to do parts negotiation, get all the parts aware of each other, get them aligned, all moving in the exact direction. And one of the things that's preventing you from using your mind to use your brain to create success is your parts are in a war. You're in a war zone, and you are the war zone. So once you can begin to identify the parts, begin to integrate, begin to interconnect, to focus on the interaction between the parts, and to get that interaction aligned, then something starts to happen. In organizations, when the parts begin to get aligned, then something starts to happen. Evan and I did a workshop on leadership, and probably one of the best business books of the last decade is Good to Great by Jim Collins, who's a Stanford professor in Stanford Business School. So what he did is he looked in a bunch of different industries, and he found two companies. One that basically had plateaued and stayed that way. One that all of a sudden started experiencing a growth curve and was able to sustain that. And he asked, what is the difference between these two? And they looked in a bunch of different areas, and one of them was leadership. And he was a leadership atheist. He thought leadership didn't matter. But his graduate students were sharper than he was on this one. And they said, wait a minute, you haven't looked at this the right way. And he says, it's simple. Good companies, lousy leaders. Great leaders, lousy companies. It doesn't make a difference. And they said, no. You got to look at it a different way. And they came up with an interesting metaphor. They said, the leader, first, let's imagine the organization is like a bus. The leader is the bus driver. And when the bus pulls out of the station, what normally happens? You get to the first corner and half the people yell, go right, and half yell, go left. The leader turns right. He's going down the block. Half of the people are yelling, turn around, and the other half are yelling at the next corner, go right or left. And after you've made 3 or 4 turns, everybody in the organization is totally split. So what do we need? So what does Collins say? Collins says the secret is to get the right people on the bus. Who are the right people? There are those whose values are aligned with the values of the leader, so that in the interaction, they will move toward cooperation, collaboration, harmony, and they'll move in the right direction. Otherwise, the bus will just continue to go in circles, which it most of the time does. Now then, you need to get the right people on your bus. Who are the right people on your bus? They're the parts of you that are aligned and that share the common values, so that they can focus energy consistently in a certain direction and persist until they create change. Now, the second thing they need to do while they're focusing that energy in order to create change is they need to see whether change is occurring. They need feedback. They need to be looking out. Feedback doesn't happen by accident. It sometimes does. But it's much more effective if we are looking for the feedback and we know what to look for, which allows us to know whether what we're doing is working, whether we're creating success or not. If we're creating success, great, then keep doing it. If it's not working, we want to discover as quickly as possible, so we waste as little time as possible so we can do something else. Once again, we keep coming back to this. It's not dialectics, it's not force. It's not force, it's requisite variety. It's not force, it's flexibility is going to be the key. And then once again, the third thing we got to do is we got to learn quick. We've got to learn quick. And so what does that mean? We said earlier that we don't learn anything. The only thing we learn from is mistakes. If we've done it and we keep doing it, then we haven't learned anything there. But if it doesn't work, we've learned. And so then there's 2 things that are the challenge. First, if it doesn't work and we don't see it, then we don't see the feedback, then we're going to waste a lot of time and energy. And second is, if it doesn't work and we get the feedback and we don't change our behavior, in other words, we haven't learned, then we're going to keep going in the same direction, which is leading downward to futility, despair, hopelessness. And is that the direction you want to go? Is that the glide path you want to be on? I don't think so. So instead, what do you want to be going? You want to be flying the plane down the runway. You want to be ready to getting to take off. You wanted to get it to start climbing high into the sky toward that goal and that destination. And as it climbs, you need to be able to take it off of autopilot so you can begin to steer it where you need to go. The choice is up to you, which you're going to do. Eben and I have made our choice. What choice will you make? I guess we're going to find out.